Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name is Khaldoun Azhari. I am moderating this event, obviously. Our event today is about the data, the mountain of data everybody of us is accumulating every day and sometimes every second, every hour. So it's a very good opportunity to learn about this and to know what is one of the most distinguished organizations, and people are telling us about it. We have today, our guest has the book, The Age of Big Data. It is one of the best-sellers book in New York recently, and also it's spreading in East Asia, especially in China. And it was translated into 20 languages. Data has become an asset or the oil of the information society, from business to politics, from healthcare to education, every segment of the society. So the same technique may enable also police to identify people who may commit crime before the person has acted. How should society respond? Will big data become Big Brother or Big Bang sometime later? Our guest today is the data editor of The Economist in London and formerly the Tokyo correspondent from 2007 till 2012. He was a member of our club and he moderated also many events. And he was also my colleague. We attended many press conferences at the Kante after the earthquake and tsunami of September 11th. And I remember he was asking very tough questions. So I used a lot of his questions to give me great insights to my reports. Thank you very much, Kenneth. And also, he is co-author of this book, Big Data. We can see it here. A revolution that will transform how we live, work, and think. It was, as I said, published last year, and it was a New York Times bestseller and has been translated into 20 languages, including Japanese. And also, he is a member, our guest member of the Economic Forum Advisory Council on Data-Driven Development. Today, our guest will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, followed by question and answer. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kenneth Cukier, our guest today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Khaldoun. I'm particularly struck by the fact that you found my questions tough. I think we both can commiserate that we didn't receive any answers to them, but at least we posed the questions. It is a great pleasure to be back here at the club. I've got many fond memories. It's my first time back since I left Japan 2 years ago, and I'm having a delightful time. It was while I was here in Japan that I had uncovered, by luck, the issue of big data. Every year at The Economist, we're asked to come up with ideas that would potentially be a cover story that we could use as a supplement inside the publication called a survey, 15 pages within The Economist and a cover story. And I thought, this is back in 2009, of what I felt was one of the most important issues in society going forward. And of course, that was East Asian trade. And so I wrote a proposal for the editors on the importance of the interlinkages of these three great countries of East Asia. And at the last minute, I didn't send it. And I thought, you know, it's interesting for people in Asia, but what is it for the rest of the world? What else is there that you can use this great benefit that The Economist offers you as a platform to talk about things that aren't being talked about? And I started with a single insight. It wasn't original, but the idea was that there's a lot of information in the world, and it's always growing. And I bet we're able to do interesting things with it. So I submitted it as a proposal, and it got accepted. And so I went off and started writing it, and I eventually finished it in January of 2010. And the term big data wasn't really a big term at the time. It was competing with lots of other terms, and I didn't actually put it into the article. But through the editing process, I thought to myself, you know, we need a term to describe these changes that are going on. And the best term that I could reach for was this term big data. It didn't mean anything, or at least it did mean something in very arcane tech circles in Silicon Valley and elsewhere in America. So I loaded up the article with the term big data. And I was, of course, very lucky, very fortunate that I did, because that was the term that stuck. It became a cover story in February of 2010, so almost 4 years ago. I've been doing this for a while, as you can tell, thinking about it. And since then, what I've watched is that the changes have been immense. You have, President Obama using the term big data. We've all now have heard of the term, but we probably don't know what it means. What I'd like to do today is explain what is big data and why it matters. And to do that, I'm going to start with a story. And the story is of a company, and the company is called Farecast. A few years ago, a computer scientist in the United States needed to take an airplane to go to his brother's wedding. It was scheduled long in advance, as weddings are, so he booked his ticket long in advance as well, because we all know that if you book the ticket far before the date of departure, you save money. He did that, but the day of departure came, he got into the airplane, and he couldn't resist. He asked the person sitting next to him, "How much did you pay?" And as it would happen, the person paid considerably less, even though he had just bought the ticket a few days before. This professor, Ornazioni, was very upset. He asked the next person, and the next, until there was a buzz at the back of the plane as everyone was sharing their stories of how much they paid, because we all know that an economy class air seat is a commodity. No one is different than another, yet everyone paid a different sum. So he was upset about this, and he designed a small little methodology on how he could actually take this and use the information to actually understand whether there's a time to buy or not. Right? He did a souped-up version of what he did in the back of the plane. He took lots of data, found out when people purchased it and what they paid for it, and found out whether a given price, what the average price should be, and whether a given price that you see online is likely to go up or is likely to go down, which would suggest either you buy it now or you should wait. He called the research project Hamlet. To buy or not to buy? That is the question. Okay? And he got venture capital funding, and he created the company. And the company went forth and started doing very well. And it started making these predictions. And he realized it wasn't just airfare that he could do it for. He could do it for anything, like where you have a commodity price, a commodity product, you have huge price variation, and you have lots of information, lots of data with which to score your prediction. So it could be hotel rooms, it could be used cars, right? But here's the thing. In 2009, he was crunching 200 billion flight price records with which to score his predictions. That represents almost every seat on every single airplane for every single route for all of American commercial aviation for an entire year. This is something that could not have been done only a few years before. Okay? Microsoft loved the idea. They bought the company for $100 million. That's great. But you also know there's another point to this story, another lesson. You just know that when the airlines created electronic passenger records in the 1960s, never for a second did they think that their own information could ever be used against them to undercut their business model. That's a change. What's happening here? Part of the story is a technology story. We can do things that we simply could not do in the past, right? We're better at it. We've got cheaper memory, faster processors, smarter algorithms. The second part is a data story. We have the information now that we didn't have in the past, and now we can actually tap this data and unleash it and find the latent value and do new things with it. But the third thing, and maybe the most important, at least for now, is the idea of the mindset. We have a new mindset, a new way in which we can appreciate information and data in ways that we couldn't before, that it can tell us things, that the data is a new resource. It's a new raw material. If you will, it's a vital economic input. Traditionally in economics, we refer to the three factors of production: land, labor, and capital. Perhaps we need to add a fourth: data. We're creating new forms of sort of 21st century digital assembly lines in which we take raw data in one direction and put out a new product and a new service in the other, exactly in the same way that Henry Ford's Red River plant took in coal and glass and steel and came out with Model T Fords on the other end. So what is big data? Honestly, there is no one single definition, and maybe that's a good thing, because to define something is to constrain it. But we can know it by some of its features, and one of its features is big. Now, that's not the only one. There's other factors as well. Some of the data comes in at huge velocity, right? Other features of big data are the fact that the bigness is not as an absolute amount, but only relative to the phenomenon that you're studying at a given time. Okay? Although big isn't the only portion of big data, it's a good place to start. And the reason why is because what we're finding with many techniques is that we can do with a large body of data things that we were unable to do when we were only working with smaller amounts. That the change of scale has led to a change of state. That a quantitative shift has led to a qualitative shift. Or if you will, more isn't just more is different. So what does more look like? More looks like this. So in the year 2000, we like to think that we were participating in the information society, but we were doing so in name only. Even back then, the amount of analog information that was stored vastly exceeded the amount of digital information. But because digital information and the analog information are things like books and vinyl LP records and paintings on the wall of a museum, but because digital information grows exponentially, that situation wouldn't change. And by the year 2002, there was about parity, and after that, it just swooned in the direction in favor of digital information. This is data from 2007, and the amount of information grows. It doubles roughly every 2 or 3 years. So what that means is that from this slide here, in 2010, the purple part would be twice as long, and the mauve part on top would be twice as small, and that would double again. So now we're down at the, we're probably through the floor, and we have a small sliver of analog information, and that's just going to keep on growing. We don't see many things that are going to stop that. You can think of it in terms of how that information is used, right? In 2003, about 20 nations of the world sequenced the first human genome for the first time, all 3 billion base pairs. Okay? Japan was a major country who participated in the Human Genome Project effort. It took them 20 years to do it. Excuse me, it took them about 10 years to do it, and it cost them about $1 billion to do. Okay. Today, a single facility, single laboratory, can do it much less. In fact, as of last January, so basically just a month ago, a company named Illumina announced that they could do it in a day at $1,000. So we can already see that the era of personalized medicine, in which we target drugs to a person's actual genome type, is really just right in front of us. I mean, that's the way that healthcare will be served in the future. But my point here is not that this is just changing biotechnology. These same trends are appearing in every field. If you're in manufacturing, if you are in retailing, if you are in advertising, if you're in media, data is growing at an exponential rate, and it's transforming the nature of your business. Behind big data are 3 features, and we talk about it in our book, and we refer to it as more, messy, and correlations. They're pretty straightforward. More refers to the fact that we have more information than ever before, but really what we're talking about is we have more information relative to the phenomenon that we're studying. We can actually aspire to something like n equals all, if you will, right? That's the statistician's lingo to suggest that you can actually get all the information on a given topic. And that's different because in the past we had to rely on sampling. And sampling is good in an era where the cost of collecting data and processing it is really high. But because a lot of those constraints have gone away, we don't have to rely on samples. We can go for all the information we can get. And by doing that, we can now drill down to the subgroups and the granular levels that sampling doesn't assess. Messiness. In the past, we've privileged the most highly curated and clean data as possible. But in the big data era, we can embrace, or at least tolerate, messiness, variation in the data, because the benefits of using orders of magnitude more data outweigh the fact that there may be some measurement error in the data that we're using after all. And the third issue is correlations. We've often tried to design our studies and try to seek out causality, understanding why things happen. But with big data, we've got so many variables. It's such a complex issue that we can just rely on correlations, and for many things, that's good enough. So let me give an example of what I mean by that. And it's the story of preemies, or if you will, premature babies. The biggest issue facing a premature baby is that it can get an infection. Infection can be deadly, so it's really important that you actually spot it prior to the infection, raging through the little kid's organs. Now, you just know, we all know that when we go to a hospital, they're going to attach lots of wires to us and lots of tubes, and they're going to collect lots of data. But we also know in the back of our mind that they don't save that data. They don't store it. They don't reanalyze it. They don't aggregate it. They don't learn from it. And I do believe that in 30 years, people are going to look back on this period in history, 2014, and think that our medical practices look a lot like bloodletting. And the reason why, it's barbaric, because we let the most valuable aspect, or one of the most valuable aspects of the patient experience, the data surrounding what works and why under what conditions, and we throw it out at the end of the treatment like a bloody bandage. And it makes no sense. But researchers are doing things differently. And what some Canadian researchers are doing is they're collecting lots of information about the premature babies. It amounts to 16 real-time streams of vital signs, everything from the heart rate to blood oxygen level to temperature. It comes to over 1,000 data points a second. And by doing that, they can actually learn. One of the things that they found is the telltale traits that they can spot the onset of an infection 24 hours before full-blown symptoms emerge. And the best predictor that a little baby is going to have an infection is not what you might think. You probably would imagine that the vital signs start to go haywire. They don't. They start to stabilize. And you can just imagine generations of doctors looking at a clipboard beside the edge of a crib, seeing the little vitals starting to stabilize and telling the nurses, things look okay, I'm going home for the night, call me if there's a problem, only to have been woken up at midnight that a tragedy is underway. Now, we don't know why that's the case. We don't know the biological mechanism at place, right? But we do know that by understanding the correlations, we can act, and act in time to save lives. Behind it are these three features. There's more data than ever before. The data's messy. Sensors are not always staying on the baby. It's getting thrown off, right? And it's only a correlation. We don't know the reason why. We only know what. But for some things, that's good enough. So why do we have so much data? Okay, one reason we have so much data in the world today is that we're collecting more information on things that we've always collected it on in the past. But another reason why is because we are collecting data on things that we never collected. We're taking things that have always been informational and we're rendering it into a data format. So think about it in terms of location, right? Where is Socrates? Is he in the hills or is he in the marketplace, right? Where Socrates is a matter of information, but it wasn't a matter of data, right? But where is Martin Curling, right? Is he at the FCCJ or is he at the izakaya, right? He's got a smartphone. We can identify and know where Martin Curling is at all times, right? Location has been datafied. It's a matter of data. Okay? Think about the way that you're all sitting right now, right? The way that Peter sits, the way that Caldone sits, the way that others sit is all very different, and it's a function of your leg and your leg length and your back and the contours of your body, etc. And you know that if I put 100 sensors into your chair right now, I can create an index that's fairly unique to you based on the way that you sit, sort of like a fingerprint, but it's not your finger. Okay, so what could I do with this? Researchers here in Tokyo are doing this, experimenting with it as a potential anti-theft device in cars. The idea is that a carjacker jumps into the driver's seat, speeds away, and the car would recognize that a non-approved driver is sitting down there. And so maybe the engine would conk out, and unless you typed in a password into the dashboard, the car would stall and you wouldn't be able to go forward, right? Sounds like a great service, really good idea. Okay. But what else could we do? Imagine every single car in Japan, every single car had this embedded into its seats. Right? What could we do? One thing we might be able to do is we might be able to spot the best predictor that foretells that an accident is about to take place in the next 5 seconds. And maybe what we will have datafied is driver fatigue. And the service then would be that when the car and the seat senses that a driver slumps into that position, the car knows to wake the person up, to send an internal alarm or vibrate the steering wheel saying, hey, pay more attention to the road. These are the sorts of things that we can do when we datify more aspects of our lives. Okay. Datafication is another way of looking through the lens at social media platforms. Twitter datifies our stray thoughts. Facebook datifies our friendships. LinkedIn datifies our professional contacts. Right? IBM has a patent with a floor covering that's like a smartphone screen, so that it can know if people enter a room or not. And maybe it's going to be able to tell who has entered the room. But what's certain is it will know that if someone standing has fallen down and didn't get up, a very useful service in an aging society. Our gait, the way we walk, our smartphones are teeming with sensors. Right? Why, oh why, do we have to enter in a password to activate it? Shouldn't the smartphone be smart enough to know we are who we are just on the basis of the way we walk? You would think so, and we'll probably get there. Apple has a patent on earbuds that collect our vital signs, and so on. When we datify more aspects of the world, we can store the information, share it, process it, and use it to extract new forms of value. So what is the value of big data? Well, in the past, it was the primary reason for which we collected the information, because we only used it for that purpose. But in the world of big data, we can reuse it for a myriad of other alternative purposes to extract new forms of value. Think about it in terms of transactions. Walmart, keeps a record of all of its sales, all its receipts, and it does that for bookkeeping purposes. All retailers do that. But a few years ago, they went through their big database of transactions, and they matched it with weather data. And what they were able to spot is a correlation that whenever there was a storm approaching in America's Northeast, not only would sales of storm supplies increase, like flashlights and batteries, but also sales of strawberry Pop-Tarts. Okay, now we don't know why that exists, but we do know that exists. And by knowing that, what we can do is that Walmart was able to realize that not only should they stock flashlights and batteries at the front of their store, they should stock Pop-Tarts there as well, and they can sell more Pop-Tarts and ease life for consumers who are rushing in and rushing back home prior to a storm. The value of big data is in the reuse of that data. The data, if you will, has become an asset, a vital corporate asset. So what does this mean for Japan? Okay. Japan's great success has been built on the back of hardware. And we all know that in Japan, for the great value and benefit of its enormous electronics industry and manufacturing industry in all areas of activity, that it actually is amazingly poor in software. A few years ago when I was here in Tokyo, I wrote an article about the electronics industry and their appalling nature of software, and I quoted a senior executive at one of the largest electronics makers who pounded the table drunkenly, shouting, "A samurai would never write software. A samurai would never write software." There's a real prejudice against it, almost like it's effeminate to write software, that real men do hardware, and the kids who couldn't hack it at school, the kids who were bullied on, would write software, right? Well, you could look at so many of the companies in the United States and understand the great benefit of the economics and the cycle times of software. I mean, just two numbers to throw out, the number would probably be 1.5 and 40, right? 1.5 represents margins on computer hardware, 40 represents margins on software. So you can see there's, probably old style 19th century thinking is going on there. So what does it mean in the world of data? Well, You know, as an American, I say with both, you know, great shame and great love for my second adopted country, Japan, that Japan crushes all Europe and America when it comes to internationalized test scores in mathematics by your high school students. There is no reason whatsoever that you can't be leaders in the world of big data, because what you need are people who have got really good math skills. You know, a lot of it is just basically about statistics and applied mathematics. Yes, there are other skills involved as well, and Japan can boost that, you know, in terms of creativity, but that's not the most operative problem, right? So you would think that Japan could be a great leader in the world of big data, but so far we've not seen a lot of activity. We've seen small, little bits of activity, but not a lot. I can say personally, though, that there's a great basis from which to build on. And I remember that after 3/11, about 2 days after the tsunami obliterated Tohoku, I was up in a car trying to get to Rikuzen Takata, right? And where we were going was through our sat-nav system. But something was really weird, right? We had a map, and we were given directions of how to get places, but the sat-nav system looked different. It looked corrupted. It didn't look right, because roads that we knew were roads were not listed on our computer satellite navigation system. Does anyone know what I'm referring to? Do you know the story? So what was happening was the sat-nav systems for many of the cars in Japan were not just simply collecting information. They were acting as beacons, sending information back. And by doing so, the sat-nav system was able to automatically update and realize that cars that were going in one direction were turning around because the road was impassable. So it no longer presented us as a road on the map. So it was incredibly efficient. It was, if you will, a living map, living in real time based on the reuse of the data, right? So what we first thought looked like a flaw was actually the smartest map in the world, and it got us to where we needed to go. And when the road became passable again, it would have automatically updated, and the road would have then appeared on the map, right? So these are the things that Japan is already doing. There's no reason why it can't be a leader in the world of big data if it wants to. There will be new rivalries in this new world of big data, right? Nagoya, Stuttgart, Detroit have burning interests in the future of personal transportation. So why, oh why, did the first self-driving car come from a search engine in California? Well, one industry, you know, perceives its business as bashing metal, and another one processing bits. Think about it in terms of pharmaceutical companies and search engine companies, Bing. A few years ago, there was a research study in which they wanted to find out if there was an adverse drug reaction between two drugs, basically a side effect, a negative side effect. If you take one drug, you have a problem, and you take another one, it creates a problem. And so what they did is they looked for searches of a certain ailment called hyperglycemia, and searches for one drug and another. One was an antidepressant, the other one lowered cholesterol. And so they wanted to see that if you take both drugs in combination, was there more likely to be searches for those symptoms of that disease, hyperglycemia, what's in the Venn diagram as the portion A. And sure enough, they struck gold. 80 million search queries later, they were able to identify that, in fact, the bottom dotted line is basically searches for the symptoms, right? And no drugs. That's background noise. The next dotted line is searches for one drug and those symptoms. The second one is searches for another drug and those symptoms. And you're twice as likely to search for those symptoms if you're searching for both of those drugs. Okay. Now, what's interesting about that is that not only were we able to identify the appearance of an adverse drug reaction by taking two drugs in combination, it's not on the label. It wasn't part of the medical study. The regulators didn't know about it. This was spotted through the search engine queries. So if you're a pharmaceutical company, maybe you should be licensing Bing data, right? If you're a regulator, maybe you should be licensing Microsoft's data. As patients, this is incredibly valuable information. And if you're Microsoft, maybe you should be in the business of licensing your information. In this new world, you can already see that access to data is one of the most valuable things. Now, to be sure, it's possible to have too much access to data. So the big data world is not without risks. I'm going to conclude on what some of these risks are. Okay. The first, of course, is privacy. Privacy has been a problem in in a small data world. It's going to be a problem in the big data world as well. It's probably a larger problem, but it's still fundamentally probably the same problem. Okay. But there is a new problem, and that is propensity. We will have algorithms that will predict what we are likely to do, and we may be held accountable, right? We may be penalized on the basis of those predictions. It's a world a little bit like pre-crime in Minority Report. So if the algorithm says that this young man has a 99% likelihood of being a shoplifter in the next 10 months, what does society do? Should it, if it doesn't act on it, it's being anti-science. And if it does, it's taking away the person's free will and moral choice. And even a 99% likelihood suggests 1 in 100 cases the person is going to not steal from the store at the given time. So we need a conversation about that. And in our book, we advocate that we should enshrine human free will and human agency in the 21st century in the same way that we enshrined procedural fairness in the justice system in the 20th century. Then there's ownership. Who owns all this information anyway? Is it the individual whose information it is, or the company who collected it? And then something that we call dataism. The 20th century was marked by the great debates over communism and fascism, socialism and capitalism. And in the 20th century, the new religion, 21st century, the new religion is probably going to be data. But in the world of big data, we need to recognize that there's fundamental limitations and inherent shortcomings in the data. The data is only a simulacrum of reality, and only an aspect of reality, in the same way that a map is not territory. So it's very important that we recognize the limitations in the data, and we exercise our own control and our judgment and our values as well. What will the future look like? I think there's going to be trillions of devices, all networked. That in the past, it was a given that it took a considerable effort to measure and quantify something. In the future, it's going to take effort not to quantify something. The presumption is that everything will be measured. I look forward to being there. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thank you very much for your insights. It's very amazing, actually, when you said that the way how people behave, if it was datafied, you can expect there, what happens, like preventing cars, stealing cars. Do you think there's a way how to predict how a marriage would be successful from datafying the people before they get married?
Absolutely. It's going to be, it's already happening. It's actually relatively easy. So in America, I think the statistic is about 1/3 of marriages in the United States are somehow begin through online dating, right? So why is that the case? Okay. Well, the reason why is that online dating is amazingly efficient in the same way that Amazon book recommendations are amazingly efficient, right? When Amazon recommends a book, it's not because they have some sort of weird notion that because you come from this zip code and it suggests that you're in New York, that you might like a book that is about New York. No, it's because they look at people who have read similar, who have bought or looked at the pages of similar books and looked at what you've purchased and match and see that if they've liked these other things as well, you probably will as well. And then when you do buy it, they score that prediction as more likely as higher. And when you don't buy it, they score it as lower. And so they can actually always improve the accuracy of that prediction. So matchmaking in America is happening through a technique of artificial intelligence called machine learning. And what it means is that if you have, say you've got 50 million people registered and you get a million dates and you find out which dates work, you can find out correlations between why certain people with certain characteristics are great matches with another. What we could also find out that couples that after they've been in a relationship but then change their status and say that they're actually back on the market, back on the relationship market, that it didn't work out, we find out that there's certain qualities of people that work really well for having a romantic relationship but don't work well for a long-term relationship. And that's really interesting. Yeah, and so everything's being transformed.
Thank you very much. Question, please. Yes. Yeah. Next.
Thank you very much. I am really, really impressed. My name is Khalil Hassan. I'm ambassador of Bahrain here. I'm originally a neonatal surgeon, but I understand how important the issue you are talking about. My question is, this century of big data, what sort of education you need to enhance it? Thank you very much.
Good. Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for that very nice compliment. So I think that the skills are very multifaceted, and it's rare that we're going to find them all in the same individual. So the big data world will move forward with collaborations and with teams. But what those skills are, and some people will have all of those skills, will be first some mathematics. You have to be able to think in a quantified way, and certainly statistics. Right? The second is going to be computer coding. That's really important too, because you need to just sort of know how that works. And those two things will be the most important, because that's sort of the infrastructure layer of big data. After that, you need a lot of creativity. So you're going to find that the people who studied poetry and art at school have a role in this new world as well. And in particular, storytelling. Right? In Japan, there's been a shift away from the Monozukuri or make things culture to the storytelling culture. And so we understand that you're going to be able to need to look at the data and be able to extract the story or the meaning or the lessons from it. And then finally, there's probably going to be an artistic element. A lot of the data is happening at a scale that is hard for the human person to understand. So what we need is to innovate at the layer of the techniques with which we visualize the data. In the 1800s, we created things like the pie chart and the line graph as a way of visualizing at what was then a lot of quantitative information. And now we have actually a new renaissance taking place in the visualization of quantitative information. So that's going to move forward as well. And altogether, I think you're going to see people with lots of different skills in this area. Where Japan does extremely well, of course, is in the math, right? And the computer development, good enough. I mean, it probably should be better relative to the size of its economy and the great pedagogy of its schools. But it's fine, right? But what they need to be able to do is encourage creativity, and that's much harder to do because there's so many facets of Japan that are more mechanistic, that prefer sort of order rather than variation and deviation, and particularly because the culture of creativity is that a lot of ideas fail before a few ideas work very well, but a lot of people wouldn't be given the second chance in Japanese companies.
Thank you. Greg?
Gregory Clark, freelance. Well, you've just now almost answered my question. In your talk about Japan's possibilities, you emphasized mathematics and didn't put much emphasis on creativity. But now, of course, creativity, it seems to me, the crucial point. And if I can add to your, maybe help give you a little piece of data, I'm very interested in decoding, me and a guy called Snowden. Australia was I come from Australia. Australia was very active in decoding Japanese material during the war. And some of the records have come out, and a surprising number of the best decoders were people with liberal arts education, with no mathematics at all. Had this creativity factor that you seem to be, that you are now emphasizing. Now, my question is, why, given all the intelligence and wisdom which the Economist, your former employer,
current employer, in fact,
the current employer, has shown over the years, why has it, until quite recently, been consistently wrong in its analyses of communist countries, particularly China?
Okay. Well, I welcome that question. I have to say emphatically that I'm surprised, deeply, deeply surprised, to hear that the Australian cryptographers had liberal arts backgrounds and not mathematical backgrounds. Best ones, yeah. And thank you. I'll leave it at that. No, I'm kidding. My faux sense of anger about the Australian cryptographers was simply a joke. I am surprised, actually, because just on that point, in Britain, it was actually the inverse. So it turns out that prior to World War II, Britain's cryptographic agency was teeming with people who, who understood languages. So they're all classicists from Oxford and Cambridge. They knew Greek, they knew Latin, and they were like crossword puzzle players. And they really thought that that was the way that you would decrypt codes, right? By just sort of thinking about it. And it was like a game. And it was actually Alan Turing, who was basically a mathematician and a statistician, and one of the earliest computer pioneers, who changed all of that. But he was one of the first mathematicians that who joined, and they literally had to take the mathematicians, and they couldn't say that they were mathematicians in their applications because mathematicians went to the war, they went to the front because they didn't think they needed mathematicians. They called them like agricultural specialists because they thought they could improve their yields, right, of the agriculture, which was so important at the time. So it's just very different that in Britain it was only when the mathematicians came that they could do it. So why is The Economist always wrong on communist countries and in particular China? Good question. I would actually say that we probably aren't, and so we'd have a healthy debate afterwards. Yeah.
Yes. Andrew.
日本語で失礼いたします。講談社週刊現代で記者をしております久保山と申します。ビッグデータの話ではなくちょっと恐縮なんですが、日本の経済について質問させていただきます。今、アベノミクスの第3の矢が停滞しておりまして、先日 TPP 交渉も決裂してしまったのですけども、日本経済の復活していく過程におきまして、安倍政権はどのような経済政策が今後必要になっているかというのをちょっとケネスさんにお尋ねしたいと思います。
Great question. It is true that I'm not the Japan correspondent, so you could ask my colleague who is Tamsin Booth. However, I think the answer is so obvious that a non-expert like me can answer, which is first, structural reform, second, more women participation in the labor force.
Thanks.
Ken, I can't tell you how great to see you again, and nice beard.
Yeah, thank you, and likewise, exactly.
What I just want to say is very quickly, the Nippon Steel factories that were the first to go to rolling, continuous rolling, the JNR bullet trains from 1964 running without accident, and the Toyota Kanban system were all uses of big data. And Japan had very sophisticated computer technologies in the 60s. Not a moon rocket, but very high-end. What I find is a little bit different from the creativity debate that's often talked about software. It's a proprietary software system that JNR would use, or Nippon Steel would use, and not an open sort of a tool set, an Oracle database, all of this stuff that we've kind of, one company invents a tool that everybody can use, like a hammer or a saw or a machine tool. In Japan, every company makes its own. So my question comes to this. In the future, will data be proprietary, or will it be somehow like that open tool? You know, my medical records, for example, I've recently had a physical at St. Luke's. You know, where will that data end up? Will I know? And can I, for example, designate it that I want this kind of nonprofit to have my medical data, but not this kind of Google or anybody else? You know what I'm saying? That sort of, yeah. It has the privacy wrapper on it, but it's really proprietary versus open.
Yeah, so great question. And in fact, it's sort of going to be the defining debate over the next decade. So I think it's going to be both, right? You're going to have both proprietary and much more proprietary answers and also open answers at the same time. Somewhat in the way that after the enclosure movement, we created a national park service, or if you will, after the advent of intellectual property, or during the advent of intellectual property, we created something called the public domain. People who didn't like copyright, didn't like the idea of public domain because they liked the idea that everything should be made public. The enclosure movement was absolutely horrendous to so many people over the course of decades. But today we can look back on it and say, well, that's what happens when you want to propertize land and there's a great benefit of having private ownership because you get the best exploitation of that resource. So as the value of data increases and people see that there's more value to it, many people are going to take things that are taken for granted and treat it with more proprietary rights around it. So I think that you'll see on one hand people taking data and holding it close and not sharing it. On the other hand, if the data is so valuable, there'll be many people who will want it, put it into the marketplace and give it a liquidity, and also in the marketplace they'll be able to get a value for it that'll be better understood. It'll take a long time for these markets around the data to come about, but that's probably how it's going to go. At the same time, there's going to be a countervailing force, right? At a world in which you get so much proprietariness, we're also in a world of great openness. So what I see happening is we're going to create, if you will, data commons being created, just like the enclosure movement created a commons as well. The very term evokes in English the idea of a common good, right? So the data commons would be, for example, the NHS. In Britain, the National Health Service has data, and they're both going through a process of being able to create a system to license that data to pharmaceutical companies who need it to improve drugs, but also open it up in an anonymized way for researchers to actually analyze and to extract value from as well. And they've already done some of that. There's a whole movement around it called the open data movement. A lot of governments are sort of ascribing to it. Even here in Japan, there's baby steps in that direction. Britain actually is the farthest along that I know, strangely, farther than America even, in terms of opening up its data sets and extracting value from it. In one example of what they've done with NHS data is they simply matched where prescriptions for a certain drug took place by the postal code. And what they were able to identify is that there was huge variation on whether doctors would prescribe an on-patent statin for blood thinning, or one that was off patent and much less. And just by being able to do that, they could identify on a county level variations between 4% to 35%. They could know, well, we should send letters to these practitioners and say, as sort of best practices, on the first order, prescribe the off-patent, less expensive medication, and if then it doesn't work, then prescribe it. And they're able to save millions of pounds a year.
Thank you. We still have, please.
Hi, I'm James Baker from Bloomberg News. When you're talking about online dating, one thing that brought to mind was job applications and getting companies' hiring practices. But I mean, how is companies going to apply this to hiring practices, and how will that be different to the sort of the psychological testing that companies do now, where you fill out a bunch of questions to see if you're fitted for your job or a job?
Yeah, excellent question. It is already actually being applied to job applications. For the moment, I don't know of it being applied for white-collar workers. That's a little bit tougher. You hire it for a variety of skills. But where it's really being applied is by large retailers and fast food organizations. Big chains, right? Because if you're McDonald's or Walmart, you have roughly about, I know the stat in America, about 50% of these sort of minimum wage workers at these large institutions, they change jobs per year. So you've got huge churn. And you're probably going to get 4 applications for every 1 job you have. So that might mean a large retailer or a large fast food company has to handle 4 million applications and hire 1 million, fill 1 million jobs annually, right? So vast, how would you know what to look for? So what they're able to do is they're able to take the resumes that have been filled out and all the things that people fill in and try to look for correlations. What best predicts that a person is going to be successful at the job, that someone is going to stay longer at the job and not leave right away? And they come up with really interesting things. So here's a few of them. Many employers discriminate against people who've served time in prison, right? Because there's a feeling that they're untrustworthy, perhaps, right? Sounds reasonable. Now, for many jobs, however, we find that people who have a criminal record actually perform better at the job and stay longer at the job than people with a clean record. Right now, why that is, we don't know, and we could try to reach for causality. Maybe it's because society is discriminating against them because it's hard to get a job that when they finally get one, they do even better at it. Or maybe there's more deference to authority. Who knows? Don't know why that is. But in the case of call center operators, right, people who have a criminal background do better than people without one. right? And they stay longer at that job. So if you are running a call center, this would be really valuable information. It turns out for other sorts of activities, again, for call center operators, that was the best because there's just so much churn, and these are sort of lower income people, and so it's just a difficult thing to manage. So there's been a lot of studies to it. They find that if you belong to, the people who do best belong to 2 or 3 social networks. But if you belong to more than 3, 4 or more, you probably are going to leave sooner, so there's going to be more attrition. And if you don't belong to any or belong only to one, that's also a negative symbol, a sign. So we're able to pick up these things that have been signals that we never knew before by crunching the data. In the past, we had people fill out these psychological surveys, but they're totally fraught with error, and part of it is that they were designed in an era of small data, in which we were producing the findings that kind of validated the studies based on a really small amount of data. Also, it's reported data, not observed data. Yes, it's true that in my first example, the data is reported as well, but it's a little bit, if you're identifying, for example, your address and your academic record, it's less prone to bias than when you're filling out survey questions, 100 survey questions on what you would do in a certain situation. So it turns out to be very effective, and I know lots of companies are saving millions of dollars a year by improving their hiring practices.
Thank you. Next question. Martin? Since that you are not in Izakaya, we know you are here.
Yeah, the one lesson we learn is if we really don't want the company to know where we are, we have to put our mobile phone in a kind of bag that insulates it from emitting any waves anyway. But is it possible to have too many data? That basically we collect so many data that in the end it becomes useless or too much to handle. Is this maybe a side effect of this big data collection society?
So if it's a human being who has to think through the data, to cogitate through it, yeah, of course, there's information overload and then it's too much. But for many techniques, well, first as a principle, you'd never want to make decisions based on less information. You probably would want more information, as long as it's valid information. However, for most of these techniques, we're not actually referring to human beings being the processor, thinker, or consumer of the information. It's machines. I'll give you an example. So the way that translation works, like Google Translate, is that we're not teaching the computer how to translate that one word means this other word. We tried to do that in the 50s and 60s and it didn't fail, and in the 70s, right? And we remember what it looked like if we typed in a word in through an online translation system. In the 90s, it didn't work very well. But if you've tried translation systems now like Google Translate, it works really well. Right? It's not perfect, but it works really well. And the reason why is we transform the nature of the problem from one of trying to get the computer to understand how a language worked by teaching it all of the rules and then all of the exceptions, to transforming the problem entirely into one of data. We just pour in lots of information and we tell the computer, you work it out. You determine that a given word in this language is the adequate substitute word for this other language based on all of these previous translations that we can get. Now, when we did that in the 90s, it got pretty good, but not great, right? And it wasn't bad, but it sort of reached a limit pretty quickly. And then we tried to optimize the algorithms and pour more money in, and we only got really small marginal improvements. And then something else happened. After we applied this technique of statistics to it and just running the probability not of what the word meant in the other word, but the adjoining words around it, so you understood the context as well, then we started pouring in more data, orders and orders of magnitude more data. And suddenly, more information, more data, increased the accuracy of the prediction. And by increasing the accuracy of the prediction, it meant that it could actually find the right substitute for the given context of the other words in that sentence better. And that's why machine translation works really well now where it didn't work in the past. So this technique, part of artificial intelligence called machine learning, transfers perfectly to another area, self-driving cars, right? When we tried to teach a car how to drive, we couldn't do it. Complex problem. Can't fit in all the rules of the road into software code. Takes too long, right? Give it lots of data. Just put sensors everywhere throughout the car and let the car infer the probability of what to do at a given time based on oodles of data. And now it works. And so if it's happening now in self-driving cars, think about reading X-rays or cell biopsies, right? That's why when we say that big data might actually destroy jobs, that we're referring to the fact that we have a whole area of knowledge worker, whereas in the 20th century we had factory automation getting rid of blue-collar workers, creating problems there. In the 21st century, we see that we're going to have white-collar workers who are going to be threatened by these new algorithms. Journalists? Well, we're already being threatened by more than just algorithms. So, yeah, well, our goose is cooked for most of us, except for ones that are creative like you.
Please. Yes, please.
Ah. 日本で演出家をしておりますことを隆一郎と申します。ビッグデータがエンターテインメントに与える影響って何かありますでしょうか。あと逆にビッグデータが新たに生み出すエンターテインメントみたいなものがあるとしたらそれは何でしょうか。
Yeah, thank you. Great question. And the answer is yes. So some of you may know of the example of House of Cards by Netflix. The way that Netflix determined that they were going to produce this show called The House of Cards, which is sort of like a thriller, is they chose Kevin Spacey and a director, David Finchley. And the reason they chose the plot, not the plot scenario, but the genre of the show, as well as the director and the actor, was based on identifying the fact that there was a huge market, a huge thirst for films that had both this director, this actor, and this genre of films. So they realized if we put a bundle like this, let's see what happens. It looks like it's going to be a real blockbuster, and indeed it has been. It's been very successful. And so does this say that creativity is dead, that we can get rid of our script writers and that we can get rid of our producers? Well, no, not at all. First, you still need a great script, and they got great scripts, so that's not a problem. You still need the producer, but what it does mean is that the producer needs to be a little bit humble. The producer can certainly say, we're not going to do this, and we're going to do this instead, but he'll lose his job if it goes wrong. He'll also mean that he's a hero if he acts in defiance of the data. There's still a room for risk-taking and creativity and acting in defiance of the data. But in a world in which you have to always make choices, and you have 100 ideas a second, and you have to just narrow down on a few of them that seem promising, this is a way to get you further up the field more quickly to sort of then deal with what might be more manageable and to execute better.
Thank you. I think we have one chance for last question. Yes, please. Yes, please. Okay. If we extend that.
Yeah, that's fine. That's totally fine. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Marco Pefrakov, and I'm a data science consultant in Japan advising Japanese companies on how to utilize big data. You gave some examples for the fact that currently Japan is not among the leading edge countries in the world in big data. What do you think are the fundamental reasons, and what needs to be done to overcome them?
So, for me, it's a mystery, frankly, why. I think Japan is, the state of Japanese society and its business culture is one of cautiousness now. So it's just not really pioneering much. Well, it's a mystery. I mean, I think Japan is just a little bit behind the times in every dimension. So I think that, I mean, no mystery, no news there, right? So I think that just because it's just more of a conservative, traditional society, nothing wrong with that. In fact, there's lots of huge benefits of that we all benefit from every day. So I think that they like to watch first and think about it and organize it and plan it, and then when they execute in a big way. I mean, just think of how they dominated microchips in the 60s, right? Microchips were created well, obviously the first transistor was in the 40s, but the semiconductor and the microchip industry was in the 50s, and then in the early 60s. And of course it was Texas Instruments, and it was Intel, right? And America owned that industry. So why is it by 1980, America was basically strangled by Japanese microprocessors? Because after they organized themselves and decided that this was going to be a priority for them, they crushed everyone, right? And that's great. I mean, the world has benefited enormously by the Japanese electronics industry. So when Japan wants to do something and they organize themselves around it, they're going to become world leaders in it. There's simply no question about that. But why haven't they done it? I don't know. I think they would need it. It requires definitely a cultural shift, because if we were in an environment where we still privilege hardware and physical innovation, and this is software, or if you will, virtual, intangible innovation, it's really an affront to many of the practices that many of the business leaders have grown up with, right? You're not going to knock on the door of the Keidon-ren and have someone who's going to say, yeah, we should go into data science. So it's going to be through startup companies, smaller companies. Is there an adequate venture capital industry? Well, probably not, right? It's hard to get funding. A lot of the venture capital actually comes from larger institutions that are even themselves more cautious, even though they shouldn't be, because it is venture capital after all. So I think you need a different looking ecosystem. You also need, startups have, stock options and job insecurity, right? And you're in a culture that doesn't really respect, stock options, and job insecurity is considered a bad thing.
Thank you. Just a minute, you want to.
はい、ゴースケとかフリーランス。As business is fascinated about big data, I have some prediction of organized crimes will be fascinating about use of big data. Do you have any observation of signs or any ideas to counter those new type of crimes?
Yeah. Thank you for your wise question. I think that's a very essential thing. I have referred to in my remarks about the positives of big data and its misuse, and particularly the idea of pre-crime, where police arrest people prior to them committing a crime. But clearly, if criminals use this, they will be able to identify things about us that we could then exploit, right, and use against us. I don't know what the answer is. I've not seen any examples of it yet, but I could come up with dark nightmares, like everyone, on what it would be. What I think we will have, though, is all technology creates these drawbacks. And what happens is the advantage will always first go to the criminals, because they're more imaginative, because they've got the great incentive to exploit the loopholes that we don't know about until they've exploited them. And then law enforcement comes in and regulates it. And we're seeing that now with cybercrime. Interestingly, we saw that with great train robberies, right, prior to the telegraph that could then communicate that there had been train robbers, etc. So I think that with big data, it's going to look a lot like cyber criminals. The criminals will have the upper hand for a long time. Law enforcement will start preparing for it. And then there'll be a sort of a balance of power, but the power will always be greater with the criminals because they have more incentives. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have time to entertain two more questions. If you can follow up later. I'm sorry. Your last question, please.
Siegfried Knittel, freelancer from Germany. I know one of the last time I saw you was in a foreign press club. You had a quarrel with Hosono and asked him very tough question, and he didn't give an answer. He said, "Tomorrow, if I don't have the data, I will come to your office and talk." It was impressed me very much. So my question is, in George Orwell, there was a great, the Big Brother who all watched us. But now I think with big data, we all kind of a Big Brother. We all want to know all about us, about our life. It's not one who is opposite us. We are all we are involved in this kind of handling with big data, and we have the advantage on one side from it. But would it be not necessary to develop a kind of thinking, perhaps not to use all data we can use?
Okay. So The Economist wrote an article a few years ago called Little Brother on just this theme, right? Which is the idea that in the great age of the 20th century, we had large monolithic institutions, and Orwell would reach for the idea of Big Brother, one government or one entity that sort of knows everything and monitors everyone. But what we've seen happen, of course, in the 21st century is we have Little Brother. Everyone has a telephone and a video camera in their pocket. We're all able to monitor each other to a certain degree. Now, it doesn't mean big institutions are going away, but it does mean that ubiquitous surveillance doesn't simply happen from the NSA. It happens from everyone around us all the time. Now, would it ever be the case that we could actually decide as a society not to use some of that data, right? And sort of exercise restraint and self-control and be more responsible with it? Well, you could look at what we do in other spheres of activity and whether that sort of wise, collective, enlightened thinking happens. The answer is generally no. So for example, take the issue of climate change. We know that we're broiling the planet to a crisp. Individuals actually acting on their own can only do a little bit about that. But what it took was larger entities to impose their interest on individuals so that they could act in the best interest of the planet. And so what I mean by that is if you're a person, it's hard for you to reduce your carbon footprint. But if Panasonic creates refrigerators that consume less energy, and they produce washing machines that consume less energy, and you buy that, then you can. But it took the company to reduce their energy consumption so that you could. So I think the only way that we're going to get meaningful control over the possibility of everyone violating everyone else's privacy is things like having cameras that make a noise, that don't click silently, so that we know when we're being recorded. You can already tell I lean towards dyspeptic views, if you will, sort of pessimistic views on whether we're going to be able to suitably exercise that self-restraint and be more respectful of each other with our privacy. I think that is unlikely. And so I think that we'll do a little bit on the margins, but in general, we're in an environment where there's going to be a ubiquitous surveillance among all of us. And it's just because the technology has allowed that to happen.
This will be the last question. Please make it short. Thank you.
日本語で。はい、ブロゴスの大谷と申します。日本においてはですね、最近鉄道会社が乗客の履歴をですね収集してビジネスにするということに対してすごく批判の声がありましたし、あとはグルメ情報サイトにですね、お店が情報を載せてほしくないということで訴訟が起きたこともあります。今後ですね、その個人が情報をですね収集してほしくない、あるいは収集されたけど消してほしい、あるいは死んだ後消してほしいとか、そういうような要望についてですね、どういうふうに考えていけばよろしいとお考えでしょうか。
There's nothing fundamentally different about those issues that couldn't have happened in an offline setting. So information access has been a constant problem throughout time. And the difference is that we have laws that make certain presumptions of the ability to copy information, to store information, to share information. And we have a new reality in how information actually gets transmitted in society. The first copyright law in the world was the Statute of Anne in 1703 in England. At the time, making copies or reproductions was amazingly costly and labor intensive. Now, modern copyright law also gave basically a 14-year term of monopoly to the owner of the work. What we have now is an environment in which we can share information at the speed of light for essentially zero marginal cost. So the entire setting of information sharing has completely changed, but the laws have actually become stricter, right? Copyright term is now between 50 and 100 years, depending on where you are. So this is a real clash, and we need to overcome it. And it's important to overcome it now in the one area of, say, written works or sound recordings and films, because in the big data era, we're going to need wise regulation as well.
Thank you very much. This wraps up our data event today. I hope all you increase your data with very useful information. We would like to extend Kenneth, our former colleague and member, with another 1-year honorary membership. We are sure you'll come here and inform us more about this such amazing technological information. Thank you very much, Kenneth.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for coming and have a nice evening.